More than 110 journalists have been killed in Gaza since Israel began its assault on the territory following the October 7th Hamas attack. Now, some South African journalists have planned a vigil in part of the country to mark and remember the media workers killed in the Israel-Hamas war. Now, the Committee to Protect Journalists says more journalists have been killed in the first 10 weeks of the war than have ever been killed in a single country over an entire year. Let's discuss this now. We're joined via Teams by Professor Ylva Rodny-Gumede, the head of the Division for Internalization and a professor in the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Firstly, let's just start with, the concerning situation around the safety of journalists in reporting on this conflict.
No, absolutely, and I think those concerns have been there since the war on Gaza started, and of course, no one could have planned for this, or there were no plans in place to cover the war, because it happened suddenly. The retaliation then by Israel after the 7 October events were quick and rapid. So and we also know that the journalists that have had access to Gaza have mainly been the Palestinians themselves, and journalists and media present, Palestinian media houses.
Prof, there's something that, I found intriguing. I was reading your article earlier on as you write about the challenges and the new opportunities that reporting on a story like this, particularly from the ICJ's perspective, presents for journalists and newsrooms, and how now we can even think of innovative and different ways to be able to do our jobs. And I wonder, in terms of the coverage of reporting, because a lot of us have watched court reporting, legal reporting over the years, how does it add another dimension?
I think there are important things that we need to understand firstly. And I think that firstly we have journalists that are on the ground. And in pre-planned events, you have journalists who can be there, who can cover a conflict and sometimes even get to the very front lines of conflict. Here you have journalists that have been part of the conflicts because they are Palestinians. Journalists are civilians, full stop, in any conflict anyway. So there are no specific rules that protects journalists, for example. But I think what is interesting with the ICJ case is exactly the fact that here we have a chance then for journalists that are not on the ground to cover the conflicts and get some of the basic facts and some of the things that are happening on the ground in ways that are being held accountable.
And Prof, while doing that, a number of people always call for context as far as journalism is concerned. How critical is context in this regard?
Context is always critical. You can't actually cover any story without understanding the conflicts. And as journalists, we read up, we do our research, and actually it's only the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, that goes into anyone's story, hey? So, and it comes through in a story, even in a short story of maybe, less than 1,000 words. The context and the background research that goes into such a story is much more than what our readers or listeners will get out of a story. But the context here is absolutely important, because I think that when you understand the ICJ case that South Africa brought, it very much comes from an understanding of humanity and the solidarity with the oppressed people of Palestine, and from a context of understanding genocide, apartheid, and a broader history and context around it.
And does it then, call for more training, particularly in newsrooms in this regard? And how then do newsrooms begin to contend with this issue of training, especially against their ever-shrinking budgets now?
Yeah, that is a difficult one. I mean, I think that when we talk about investing in coverage and investing in training of journalists, there's always a question of where do you put the emphasis? I think that good journalistic training talks to providing journalists with good research skills, the ethics and the codes of conduct of good journalism. And I think those are the sort of, the basic tenets of journalism and journalism training and the training. To understand a particular issue or a conflict takes much more. Then it's the research being done by an individual journalist or a team of journalists or a channel or the global media, fraternity.
So does it then, I mean, one thinks about all of this and, how it could then help even us as journalists as we cover the story to just dig deeper and go beyond the rhetoric, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. We must always go beyond the rhetoric. We are not dabbling in rhetoric as journalists. We are trying to get to understanding why things have happened. And I think that's what we try to communicate to our viewers and our listeners as journalists. And I think that in the case of Gaza, it's the war, it's what's happening on the ground. And when we don't have access to that, and I think this is the point that I've been trying to make, the court has provided a platform to get some of that information. And I think that's been the beauty of the South African case, is that we've had the legal documents, we had the submission to the court. It gave us an insight into why this should be labeled a genocide, for example.
And I suppose then, Prof, as we end up, our discussion, as we ended off there, there's also this very real, threat that you and I touched on at the beginning of our conversation. The fact that we are seeing more and more journalists being killed in this particular conflict, is that in itself concerning? And I suppose newsrooms also have to grapple with how they keep journalists safe.
Absolutely, and I think this is something that we pay too little attention to when we actually send journalists to conflict zones and war zones. And I think that the fact of the matter is that we have quite strict rules on the codes of conduct and ethics and how we should conduct ourselves as journalists in particular contexts and situations. But I think that there's way too little regulation and laws that actually regulates the protection of journalists.